They warned me the Alpha King hadn't tasted food or felt a single emotion in 11 long years. He was a man made of cold stone, locked inside a fortress of pure grief. I was just a village widow, summoned to his towering castle to cook one last healing broth for his dying father. I was told to keep my head down. I wasn't supposed to look the terrifying king in the eyes. I definitely wasn't supposed to see the broken man hiding beneath all that heavy armor. And I never could have guessed that a simple bowl of soup would be the very thing to bring a silent beast to his knees and capture my heart in the process. The first time Claire Thornwood saw the Alpha King of Ashford, she was holding a pot of soup so heavy her arms had gone numb, and he was looking at her as though she had no right to be standing on his castle steps. She did not blame him for that look. The truth was, she had no right to be there. She was a widow from the village below the hill, a woman with calloused hands and a patched gray-blue dress, and the only reason she had been summoned at all was that the steward had heard she cooked for the cit. Lord Edgar, the old Alpha, had been failing for weeks. The castle cooks had tried everything their copper pots and spice racks could offer. Nothing stayed in his stomach. Nothing eased the rattle in his chest. And so the steward, a thin man with nervous eyes, had ridden down to Thornwood at dawn and knocked on her door. "You are Claire? The one who nursed the miller's wife through the fever?" "I am," she had said, wiping her hands on her apron. "But I'm not a healer. I just cook." "That is precisely what we need," the steward had said, and he had not smiled. Now she stood at the gate of Ashford Castle, and the wind carried the smell of wood smoke and wet stone, and the Alpha King stood before her in his black leather and gray cloak, tall enough to block the pale autumn sun. His eyes were the color of slate after rain. There was a scar through his left eyebrow, and another, older and deeper, running across the palm of his left hand. She saw it when he lifted that hand to stop her. "Who is this?" His voice was low. It did not ask. It demanded. The steward bowed so low his spine cracked. "My lord, this is the woman from Thornwood, the one who cooks for the sick. We thought—" "I did not ask what you thought." Claire stood very still. The soup pot was heavy in her arms, and the heat of it seeped through the cloth she had wrapped around the handles. She could feel her palms sweating. She could feel the eyes of the guards on either side of the gate, and the eyes of a young man in a soldier's tunic who stood half a step behind the Alpha, holding the leash of a large patient hound. She should look down. She knew she should look down. That was what a woman from the village did when the Alpha spoke. But her arms ached, and the soup was for a sick old man, and something in her, the same stubborn something that had kept her alive through the winter after her husband died, would not let her drop her gaze entirely. She looked at his chin instead. It was a safe place, neither his eyes nor his boots. "My lord," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had expected. "I was told your father cannot keep food down. I make a broth with barley and wild herbs that settles the stomach. If it is not too much trouble, I would like to try." The silence stretched. Behind her, she heard one of the guards shift his weight. The hound whined softly, and the young soldier hushed it. Then the Alpha King said, "You would like to try." It was not a question. It was a stone dropped into still water. "Yes, my lord." "Who taught you to cook for the sick?" "My mother, and my husband." She paused. "They are both gone now." Something flickered in his slate eyes. She saw it even though she was looking at his chin. It was there and gone so fast she might have imagined it. Then he turned, his cloak swinging, and walked through the gate without another word. The steward exhaled so loudly it was almost a sob. "Come, come," he whispered, tugging at her sleeve. "Follow quickly. Do not keep him waiting." Claire followed. The castle kitchens were vast and cold. Great hearths leaned to walls, their fires banked low at this hour. Copper pots hung from iron hooks like sleeping bells. A boy of about 12 was scrubbing a table with sand, and he looked up when she entered, his eyes wide. The steward gestured at a long wooden table near the largest hearth. "Set it there. The Lord Edgar's chamber is up the east stair. I will bring the broth up when it is ready." "No," Claire said quietly. "I will bring it up myself." The steward blinked. "That is not— I need to see him. I need to see the color of his face and hear the way he breathes, or I cannot know if the broth is right for him." She set the pot down and began to unwrap the cloth from the handles. You can stand at the door and watch me if you like, but I need to see him." The steward looked at her as though she had suggested setting the castle on fire. But before he could answer, a voice came from the doorway. "She is right." Claire turned. The Alpha King stood in the kitchen doorway, filling it entirely. He had removed his cloak. Under it he wore a simple dark tunic, and she could see the breadth of his shoulders, the way his arms crossed over his chest as he leaned against the frame. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the pot. "My father will not eat for strangers," he said, "but he might eat for someone who looks at him like that." "Like what, my lord?" "Like he is a person and not a dying man." He uncrossed his arms and walked toward the table. Up close, he was even larger. She had to tip her head back to see his face, and she caught the full force of those slate eyes before she could look away. "What is in the pot?" "Barley, chicken broth, a little onion, and a handful of herbs I dried myself. Wild thyme and a bit of sage. Nothing heavy, nothing that will fight his stomach. Will, though, help his chest. It will not hurt it, and if he can keep it down, it will give him strength to fight the sickness himself. That is all food can do. My lord, it cannot cure. It can only give him the strength to cure himself." He was quiet for a long moment, then he said, "I have not tasted anything in years." She did not understand. She frowned. "My lord, my cooks. They bring me food and I eat it, but I do not taste it." He said it flatly, as though he were telling her the weather. "I have heard that beef can do that. I have heard that a man can lose his taste the way he loses an arm. I do not know if that is true. I only know that I have not tasted my own food in 11 years. Claire stood very still. The kitchen was warm, but she felt a chill run down her spine. 11 years? His mother had died when he was young. The whole village knew that story. The boy who had watched his mother waste away, who had grown into a man who could not taste his own bread. She did not say any of this. She said, "I am sorry, my lord. That must be very lonely." He looked at her. For the first time he looked at her as though she were not a stranger at his gate. Not a village woman with a heavy pot, but a person. It lasted only a breath. Then he turned and walked to the stair. "Bring the broth up," he said over his shoulder. "I will be there. If it is too hot, I will tell you." Claire picked up the pot. Her arms ached, and her heart was beating too fast, and she did not know if it was fear or something else. She followed him up the east stair, past tapestries of hunts and battles, past windows that let in the gray autumn light, and she thought about what he had said. "I have not tasted anything in years." You see, for a man who had lost his taste years ago, soup was never just soup. It was a door that had been locked for so long that the hinges had rusted shut, and Claire, with her barley, and her wild thyme and her steady calloused hands, was about to put her shoulder to that door without knowing it. Lord Edgar's chamber was dim and close, heavy with the smell of sickness and old wood. The old Alpha lay propped against pillows, his face gray as the ash in the hearth, his breath a shallow rattle. His hands rested on the blanket, and in one of them he held a single dark feather, worn soft from years of handling. Claire set the pot on a small table beside the bed and ladled a portion into a clay bowl. The old man's eyes opened at the sound. They were the same slate gray as his son's, but faded, tired. "Who," he rasped, "are you?" "Claire, my lord." "From Thornwood Village." She dipped a spoon into the broth and lifted it, blowing on it gently. "I brought you something to drink. Nothing heavy, just a little warmth." "I have lived through worse," the old man said, but he did not refuse the spoon. He took 3 mouthfuls before his eyes closed again. His breath evened out, the rattle easing slightly. Behind her, Claire heard a sound, a long, slow exhale. She turned. The Alpha King stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He was looking at his father, and his eyes were wet. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Claire looked down at the bowl in her hands, and she understood, with a quiet and terrible clarity, that she had just walked into something far larger than a kitchen. She had walked into a house of grief, and she was holding a spoonful of warmth. Claire did not sleep that night. The castle gave her a narrow room in the servants' wing, with a straw mattress and a single window that looked out over the dark courtyard. She lay on her chinkly think this day, listening to the wind scrape against the stone, and she thought about the old man's breath, how it had evened out under her spoon, how the rattle had eased. She thought about the Alpha King's wet eyes, and the way he had stood in the doorway like a man who had forgotten how to ask for help. By the time the first gray light touched the window, she had decided to leave. She dressed in her gray-blue dress, pinned her hair back with the same copper clip she had worn for 8 years, and made her way down the narrow stairs toward the kitchen. She would thank the steward for his kindness, collect her pot, and walk back to Thornwood before the village bell rang for morning chores. That was the sensible thing. That was the safe thing. The kitchen was empty save for the cook's boy, who was feeding the fire with the sleepy, mechanical movements of someone who had been up since before dawn. He looked up when she entered, blinked, and said nothing. "I came for my pot," Claire said softly. The boy pointed to the corner where her iron pot sat clean and dry beside the hearth, scrubbed until it gleamed. Someone had taken care of it. That surprised her more than it should have. She was lifting the pot when she heard footsteps behind her, heavy, deliberate. The footsteps of someone who did not need to hurry. She turned, and there he was. The Alpha King stood in the kitchen doorway, filling it entirely. He wore no armor this morning, just a dark wool tunic and leather breeches. And without the black plate he looked different, younger somehow, and more tired. His hair was uncombed. There was a shadow of beard along his jaw that had not been there the day before. "You are leaving," he said. It was not a question. Claire's grip tightened on the pot handle. "Yes, my lord. The soup is must." My father ate again this morning." She blinked. "He, 2 bowls," William said. "He woke at dawn and asked for the woman with the yellow broth. He did not know your name. He called you the woman with the yellow broth." The corner of his mouth moved almost imperceptibly. "I have not seen him eat 2 bowls in a month." Claire did not know what to say to that. She stood there, holding her pot, feeling the weight of it in her arms and the weight of his words in her chest. "I am glad," she managed. "I am glad he is better." "He is not better," William said flatly. "He is the same. He will be the same tomorrow, and the day after. But this morning, he ate 2 bowls of broth, and he asked for more." He took a step into the kitchen, and the boy by the fire seemed to shrink into himself. "You did that. It was only soup, my lord." "It was not only soup." The silence stretched between them, thick as winter wool. Claire felt her pulse in her throat. She had been in the castle less than a day, and already she had seen the Alpha King cry, and now he was standing in his own kitchen telling her that soup was not soup. This was not the safe path. This was not the sensible thing. "I should go home," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "My cottage, my garden. I have herbs drying and the chickens." "There is a fire in the front hall," William said, "and the cook's boy will bring you tea. You have not eaten." She stared at him. He stared back, unmoving, as if he had simply stated a fact of the weather. "I do not understand, my lord." "You made my father eat," he said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "I am offering you breakfast. It is not a complicated transaction." It was, perhaps, the most awkward attempt at hospitality Claire, I think, ever witnessed. She should have laughed. She should have refused. Instead, she set the pot back down on the counter, and she heard herself say, "If it is not too much trouble, my lord, I would like to see him first, your father, to see how he is breathing." William's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought she had overstepped. Then he turned without a word and walked toward the stairs. After 3 steps, he stopped and looked over his shoulder. "Well," he said, "are you coming?" The old man's room smelled of wood smoke and lavender, and the fire in the hearth had been banked low, casting long shadows across the walls. Lord Edgar was propped up on a stack of pillows, his eyes half open, his hands resting on the blanket. In one hand, he held a gray feather. Claire's breath caught. She had seen that feather the night before, but in the dim light she had not understood it. Now, in the gray morning, she saw it clearly. A hawk's feather, worn smooth at the shaft, as if it had been held 1,000 times. "You came back," Edgar said, his voice thin but clear. His eyes found her face, and something in them softened. "The yellow broth woman." "Claire, my lord, from Thornwood." "Claire." He tested the name like a new word. "You have kind hands. My son tells me I ate 2 bowls." "Heard it from his own mouth," William muttered from the doorway, and Edgar made a sound that was almost a laugh. Claire crossed to the bed and knelt beside it, close enough to see the old man's face properly. His skin was sallow, drawn tight over sharp bones, but his eyes were clear, and there was a faint color in his cheeks that had not been there the night before. "May I?" she asked, reaching toward his wrist. He nodded, and she took his hand gently, feeling for his pulse. It was thready but steady. Think counted under her breath, then released him. "You are doing better than you think," she said. "But you need more than broth, my lord. You need meat and bread and something green. I can make a stew with barley and turnips if you will eat it." "I will eat anything that does not taste like the healer's bitter tea," Edgar said. Behind her, William made a sound, short, almost like a cough. Claire glanced back and caught him looking at the feather in his father's hand. His expression was unreadable, but she saw his left hand move, his thumb tracing the scar across his palm. She looked away quickly, because she understood suddenly and completely that she had seen more of this family's grief in one morning than most people saw in a lifetime. The kitchen was warm by the time she came back down. The cook's boy had laid out bread and cheese and a pot of honey on the long wooden table, and there was a chipped ceramic mug of tea steaming beside a plate. "Sit," William said, and it was not an invitation. Claire sat. She broke a piece of bread and ate it slowly, tasting the coarse grain and the salt. William sat across from her, but he did not eat. He just watched her, his gray-blue eyes steady and unreadable. "You make him laugh," he said finally. "I have not heard my father laugh in a year." "I did not make him laugh, my lord. He made himself laugh. You are doing it again." "Doing what?" "Deflecting." He said the word flatly, without accusation. "I watched you last night. You feed a man, you check his pulse, you speak soft words, and then you try to disappear. You were leaving this morning. You would have walked out of this castle and never looked back, and my father would have asked for the yellow broth woman, and I would have had to tell him she was a ghost." Claire's hand stilled on the bread. "I am not a ghost, my lord. I am a widow from Thornwood, with a leaking roof and 3 chickens and a garden full of weeds. I am nobody." "You are somebody who made my father eat," William said. "That is not nothing." The word widow hung in the air between them. William did not ask. He did not press. He simply sat there, waiting. And Claire realized with a start that he was giving her space to say more, or to say nothing. She chose nothing. She finished her bread, she drank her tea. And then, because the silence had become something almost comfortable, she stood and carried her mug to the wash basin. "I will make the stew," she said, "and I will stay until tonight, if it is not too much trouble, but I must go home before dark. My chickens—" "I will send a man to feed your chickens," William said. She turned, surprised. "You do not even know where I live." "Thornwood, gray cottage at the edge of the lane, west of the mill, with a leaking roof and a garden full of weeds." He said it without expression. "I know everything in my lands, Claire of Thornwood. I have known your name since the moment you crossed my gate." Her heart did something strange then, a small, tight flutter that she refused to name. She turned back to the wash basin and began to scrub the mug harder than necessary. "Your father's feather," she said, to change the subject. "It is a hawk's feather. He held it all night." William was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower, rougher. "It was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to him the day they were married. It is the only thing of hers he kept." Claire's hands stilled. She did not turn around. She stood there, gripping the wet mug, and she felt the weight of that knowledge settle into her chest like a stone. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I am sorry for your loss, my lord." "It was 11 years ago," William said. "I do not think about it." But she heard the lie in his voice, and she knew with a quiet certainty that he did think about it, every day, every hour, every time he looked at his father and saw the feather in his hand. She dried the mug and set it on the counter. Then she turned to face him. "I will make the stew," she said, "and I will stay until tonight, but I am not doing it for you or for your father, or because you asked me to. I am doing it because that old man upstairs has kind eyes and a feather he has held for 11 years, and no one should have to eat the healer's bitter tea when they are that tired." William's eyes flickered. For a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw something crack in his careful, silent armor. Then he nodded once and stood. "The stew will need meat," he said. "I will have the huntmaster send a haunch of venison. That would be kind, my lord." "It is not kindness," William said, and his voice was strange, almost rough. "It is payment." "For the soup?" He walked out of the kitchen and Claire stood alone by the wash basin, listening to his footsteps fade down the corridor. She pressed her hand to her chest, where her heart was still fluttering, and she told herself it was only the strangeness of the day. It was not only the strangeness of the day. The venison arrived within the hour. A young buck, dressed and jointed, wrapped in clean linen. The cook's boy gawked at it as if it were gold. Claire set to work, chopping turnips and onions, grinding pepper with the flat of her knife, filling the kitchen with the sharp, good smell of food that was being made with intent. She worked through the afternoon, and the kitchen became tink and loud with her labor. She hummed as she stirred, an old tune her mother had taught her, half forgotten, rising unbidden from some deep place. And the cook's boy listened, silent as the stew came together. By dusk, the pot was full and fragrant, and Claire carried a bowl up to Lord Edgar herself. He ate it all. When she came back down with the empty bowl, William was standing by the hearth, his back to her, one hand braced on the mantel. He did not turn around. "Is he asleep?" he asked. "Yes, my lord. He ate the whole bowl. He said it was the best thing he had tasted in years." "He has not tasted anything in years," William said quietly. "None of us have." Claire set the bowl down on the table. She should have left then. She had her pot, her chickens, her leaking roof, her sensible, quiet life in Thornwood. She should have walked out the door and never looked back. But she looked at the Alpha King's broad back, and she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the mantel, the faint tremor she would have missed if she had not been watching. "There is some left in the pot," she said softly, "if you would like to taste it, my lord." He did not answer for a long moment. Then he turned, slowly, and his eyes met hers. "I cannot taste it," he said. "I told you, I lost my taste 11 years ago." "If it is not too much trouble," Claire said, "I would still like you to try." Silence. The fire crackled. The cook's boy had vanished. Somewhere, leaving them alone in the warm amber light of the kitchen, William crossed the table, picked up the ladle, and filled a small bowl with stew. He lifted it to his lips. He drank. The bowl lowered. His hand trembled. Claire watched his face, the way his eyes went wide, the way his throat worked as he swallowed again. He let them looked down at the bowl, then up at her, and his voice when it came was barely a whisper. "What," he breathed, "is in this?" "Barley, turnips, venison," she paused. "And a little pepper." "No," he said, his voice cracked. "There is something else." Claire looked at him, at the Alpha King of Ashford standing in his own kitchen with a bowl of stew in his hands and tears standing in his gray-blue eyes, and she answered him honestly. "My mother's recipe, my lord. She used to say that soup is not about the ingredients, it is about what you put into it while no one is watching." William stared at her. The bowl trembled in his hands. "I can taste it," he said. "I can taste it." And Claire, who had been so determined to leave that morning, understood that she was not going anywhere. The castle was still dark when Claire woke. She had not slept well. The unfamiliar bed, the weight of the day before, the image of William's gray-blue eyes wet with tears. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, and then she rose. She knew she should not be here. She was a village widow, a cook, a woman who had no business in the halls of House Ashford. And yet her feet carried her down the narrow servants' stairs, through the cold corridor, and into the kitchen before she had fully decided to go anywhere at all. The kitchen was empty. The great hearth still glowed with embers from the night before, and Claire found herself reaching for the iron kettle before she could think twice about it. She had seen the way Lord Edgar's breath caught in his chest when he laughed. She had seen the gray pallor under his skin, the way his fingers trembled around the eagle feather he kept in his pocket. The man was not merely old and tired. He was ill in a way that the castle's handlers had not yet named. And Claire, who had spent 10 years tending to sick animals and sicker men, knew that sometimes the only thing that helped was a warm drink before dawn, when the lungs were at their worst. She moved quietly, dried elderflower from her satchel, a slice of ginger root, honey from the crock by the window. She set the water to boil and crushed the herbs between her fingers, letting the sharp, clean smell rise into the cold air. She did not hear him come in. "Explain yourself." The voice was low and hard, and Claire spun around so fast that she nearly knocked the kettle off its hook. William stood in the doorway, his dark hair disheveled, his tunic half-laced, his gray-blue eyes sharp with suspicion. He looked like a man who had not slept either. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs. "My lord, I did not mean to. You are in my kitchen before dawn, brewing something I do not recognize, and you expect me to believe you did not mean to?" His voice was cold, but there was something underneath it, a tremor, almost. Claire forced herself to breathe. She held up her hands, showing him the crushed elderflower on her palms. "It is for your father, my lord. His breathing worsens in the cold hours. The healer's tinctures are too strong for him. They make him drowsy and weak. This is gentler. It will ease his chest without dulling his mind." William stared at her. The suspicion did not leave his eyes, but something in his shoulders loosened. Just barely. "Who taught you this?" he asked. "My mother. She was not a healer, but she knew the old remedies. She used to say that the body speaks in whispers, and the wise listen before it has to shout." A long silence stretched between them. The kettle began to sing, and Claire turned to lift it off the fire, her hand. Thinking in, steady, even though her knees felt weak. "You should have asked permission," William said at last. "You would have said no." "Yes." "Then I am glad I did not ask." The words came out before she could stop them, and Claire froze, waiting for the storm, but William did not rage. He stood there, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she could not read. "You are not afraid of me," he said slowly. "I am terrified of you, my lord, but your father is more important than my fear." The words hung in the air between them. William's jaw tightened, and for a moment Claire thought she had overstepped, that he would throw her out into the cold morning, but instead, he uncrossed his arms and stepped aside. "Finish it," he said, "and wake me when you take it to him. I want to be there." Claire nodded, not trusting her voice. William turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Do not tell him I asked," he said quietly. "He would only worry." And then he was gone, and Claire stood alone in the kitchen with the steaming kettle and the sharp smell of elderflower, her heart still racing. She finished the drink in silence. She poured it into a clay cup, covered it with a clean cloth to keep it warm, and then she stood at the kitchen window, watching the first gray light creep over the hills. She had been in the castle for less than 2 days, and already she was lying awake at night, worrying about an old man she barely knew, and arguing with a king who could have her thrown in the stocks for her impertinence. She should leave. She should go back to her cottage, her herbs, her quiet life in the village. She should stop pretending that she belonged here, because she did not. But she did not leave. She stood at the window until the light grew stronger, and then she carried the clay cup. Think the cold stone stairs to Lord Edgar's chambers. He was awake when she entered, propped against his pillows with the eagle feather in his hand. His eyes, gray, like his son's but softer, crinkled when he saw her. "Ah, the little cook," he said. "I was hoping you would come. I dreamed of my wife's barley soup last night, and I woke up hungry for the first time in weeks." Claire smiled and set the cup down on the bedside table. "This is not soup, my lord, but it will help your breathing. Drink it slowly and tell me if it eases the tightness in your chest." Edgar took the cup and sipped. His eyebrows rose. "Elderflower and ginger, my wife used to make this. She said it was for the lungs, but I always suspected she just liked the smell." He drank the rest in silence, and Claire watched the color rise slowly into his cheeks. He was still pale, still thin, but there was a brightness in his eyes that had not been there the day before. "You have a gift," Edgar said, setting the cup down. "My son does not trust it. He trusts nothing that comes without a price. But I am an old man, and I have learned that the best things in life are usually given freely." Claire looked down at her hands. "I do not want payment, my lord. I only want—" She stopped. She did not know what she wanted. To help, to matter, to feel for one moment that her hands could still do something good in the world. Edgar reached out and patted her hand. His skin was papery and warm. "You want to be useful," he said gently. "I understand. I have been useless for 3 months now, and it is a bitter thing. But you are not useless, child. You are the first person in a long time who has made me feel like a man instead of a dying old fool." Claire's throat tightened. She squeezed his hand, then stood. "I will make on a proper stew for midday," she said, "with leeks and turnips and a little thyme. It will put color in your cheeks." "I look forward to it," Edgar said, and as she turned to leave, he added, He came to see me this morning, before you arrived. He sat in that chair for an hour and did not say a word. He has not done that in months." Claire paused at the door, her hand on the latch. "Perhaps he is learning to be still," she said softly. "Perhaps that is a kind of healing too." She left before he could answer, and she did not see William in the corridor, standing in the shadow of the alcove, his hand pressed over his mouth, his eyes wet. The day passed in a blur of kitchen work. Claire made the stew, rich and golden, with thick slices of turnip and tender chunks of venison seasoned with thyme and a pinch of pepper, the way she had learned from her mother. She carried it up to Edgar at midday, and he ate every bite, praising her with the enthusiasm of a man who had forgotten what good food tasted like. She did not see William again until evening. She was alone in the kitchen, scrubbing the last of the pots, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, a bundle of firewood in his arms. "You should not carry those up the stairs yourself," he said, his voice gruff. "The steps are uneven. You could fall." Claire blinked. "I have carried heavier things than firewood, my lord. I am stronger than I look." "I did not say you were weak." He set the firewood down by the hearth and straightened up, his gray-blue eyes meeting hers. "I said the steps are uneven. It is not an insult to accept help." It was so unexpected, so unlike the cold, guarded man she had met 2 days ago, that Claire did not know what to say. She stood there with the scrod bush dripping in her hand, and William looked almost uncomfortable, as if he had said too much. "The stew was good," he said at last. "My father has not eaten that much in weeks. He stopped, his jaw working. "I am grateful." It was the first time he had said the words. Claire's heart gave a strange, painful lurch. "You do not need to thank me, my lord. I am only doing what anyone would do." "No," William said quietly. "That is not true, and you know it." He turned and left before she could answer, and Claire stood alone in the kitchen with the fire crackling and the smell of wood smoke in the air, and she understood, with a certainty that frightened her, that she was no longer just a cook who had been hired to feed a sick old man. She was part of something now, something she did not fully understand, but something she could not walk away from. That night, when she climbed the stairs to her small room, she passed Lord Edgar's door and heard a sound that made her stop. It was a cough, deep, racking, and wet. It went on for a long time, and when it finally subsided, she heard Edgar's voice, hoarse and tired, speaking to the empty room. "I've lived through worse," he said. "I've lived through worse." Claire stood in the dark corridor, her hand pressed to her chest, and she did not move until the silence settled again. Then she walked quietly to her room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall. The cough was not the cough of a man with a cold. It was the cough of a man whose lungs were failing, and Claire, who had heard that sound before in the last weeks of her husband's life, knew that no amount of elderflower and ginger would fix it. She sat in the dark for a long time, and in the morning she woke before dawn again, and she went down to the kitchen, and she brewed the elderflower tea, and she did not think about the fact that she had nowhere else to be and no reason to stay. She stayed anyway. The third morning in the castle, Claire woke to the sound of rain against the window, and for a moment she forgot where she was. The bed was too soft, the ceiling was too high, and the silence outside was the silence of a place where no rooster crowed and no neighbor called across a fence. Then she remembered the wet cough from the night before, and she got up and she washed her face in the cold water, and she went down to the kitchen before the servants had even stirred the fire. She had decided sometime in the dark hours that she would not run from the sound of that cough. She would not pretend it was normal. She would do what she could with what she had, and if what she had was only elderflower and ginger and a steady hand with a ladle, then that would have to be enough. The kitchen was cold and dim. Claire lit the fire herself, fed the kindling until it caught, and set a pot of water to boil. She had just begun to chop a turnip when she heard footsteps behind her, and she turned, expecting the cook or a maid. It was William. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, still wearing the dark tunic from the night before, and he looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "You are up early." "So are you," Claire said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice sounded, because her hands were not steady at all. William did not answer. He walked past her to the far corner of the kitchen, where a small barrel of ale sat, and he poured himself a cup. He did not offer her any. He did not sit down. He just stood by the window, drinking his ale, watching the rain fall on the courtyards. Claire went back to her turnips. She chopped them small the way her mother had taught her, because small pieces cooked faster and released their sweetness into the broth. She peeled a parsnip, then another. She sliced a leek in half and rinsed the grit from between the leaves. The silence stretched, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had not yet learned how to talk to each other, but who had agreed, without saying so, to share the same air for a while. "You have been feeding my father," William said at last, without turning around. "Yes," Claire said. "He ate all of the venison stew, Bran told me." "I am glad." "He has not eaten a full meal in weeks," William said, and there was something careful in his voice, something almost fragile. "The cook says he picks at his plate like a bird, but he ate the stew." "Hunger is not the problem," Claire said quietly. "A man will not eat if he sees no point in eating. Your father needs a reason to get up in the morning. The stew was just—" She paused, searching for the word. "It was just a small reason. That is all." William turned to look at her then, and for a moment his face was unguarded. He looked like a man who had just been told something he had been waiting to hear for a very long time, but did not know how to accept it. Then he drank the rest of his ale in one long swallow, set the cup down, and left the kitchen without another word. Claire stood there for a moment, her hands wet with leek juice, and she wondered what she had said that had touched him so deeply. Then she shook her head and went back to the pot. She spent the rest of the morning preparing a broth for Edgar, a thick barley soup with mushrooms and a few precious threads of saffron she had found in the pant. Thingini. She tasted it twice, adjusted the salt, and carried a bowl up to his room. Edgar was sitting up in bed today, his face less pale than it had been the day before. His eyes were clear, and there was a hint of color in his cheeks that had not been there when she first arrived. "You are a miracle worker," he said, as she set the tray on his lap. "I slept through the night, did not cough once until dawn." Claire smiled, but the smile did not quite reach her eyes. She had heard the cough herself, at the end of the corridor, and she knew he was telling a kind lie to spare her worry. But she did not argue. She simply sat in the chair by the window and watched him eat. Edgar took a spoonful of the barley soup, then another, and he nodded slowly. "This is good. This is very good. My wife used to make something like this. When we were first married, she would put mushrooms in everything. I used to tease her about it." "That is a kind memory," Claire said softly. Edgar set his spoon down and reached under his pillow. When he drew his hand out, he was holding a small, worn object, and he held it out to her. It was a cup, a small drinking cup, made of dark blue clay, with a pattern of vines and leaves painted around the rim. It was old, clearly, decades old, and there was a thin crack running from the rim halfway down the side, held together by an old repair of some kind. "I want you to have this," Edgar said. Claire's hands closed around the cup, and she felt the weight of it, the warmth of the old clay. "My lord, I cannot take this. It is clearly precious to you." "It was my wife's." Edgar's voice was gentle. "She brought it with her when she came to Ashford as a bride. It was her mother's before that. She used to drink her morning tea from it every day until the day she died. After she was gone, I could not bear to look at it, so I put it away. But now," he looked at Claire with a tired, kind smile, "now it seems right that someone who cooks with such care should have a cup worth drinking from." Claire's eyes stung, and she looked down at the cup, tracing the painted vines with her thumb. "I do not know what to say." "Say you will use it," Edgar said. "That is all I ask." Claire nodded, and she tucked the cup carefully into the pocket of her apron. I will use it every day." Edgar smiled, and he went back to his soup. Later that afternoon, Claire found herself alone in the kitchen again, preparing the evening meal. She had set the blue cup on the windowsill in the light, where she could see it while she worked. It was a small thing, but it made the kitchen feel different, as if the room had grown warmer. She was chopping onions when her hand slipped. The knife glanced off the side of the onion and hit the windowsill, and the blue cup wobbled, tipped, and fell to the stone floor with a sharp, terrible crack. Claire stared at the pieces on the floor. The cup lay shattered in 3 large pieces, and a scatter of smaller shards, the painted vines now broken across the cracks. For a moment she could not breathe. Then she knelt down and reached for the pieces with shaking hands. "Oh no," she whispered. "Oh no, no, no! Claire!" She looked up. William stood in the doorway, his eyes moving from her face to the floor, and then he saw the broken pieces and his expression shifted. "I am sorry," Claire said, and her voice came out high and tight, the words tumbling over each other. "I am so sorry. I did not mean to. It was an accident. I set it on the windowsill and I was chopping onions and my hand slipped. I am so sorry. Your father gave... Thanks to me this morning. I should have been more careful." She stopped because William had walked across the kitchen and knelt down beside her. He did not speak. He just reached down and picked up the largest piece, the one with the painted vine still visible, and turned it over in his hands. "It was his wife's," Claire said, and her voice cracked. "He gave it to me this morning. He said it was his wife's cup, and he wanted me to have it because I cook with care. And I broke it. I broke his wife's cup." William was silent for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "It was already cracked." Claire blinked. "What?" He held the piece out to her, and she saw it. The thin line of an old repair running through the clay. It was already cracked. Someone had glued it back together before. It was not a perfect cup. "That does not make it less precious," Claire said, and her voice was thick. "No," William agreed, "it does not." He sat back on his heels, looking at the pieces scattered on the stone floor. Then he said, "We can glue it. The pieces are large enough. It will not be perfect, but it will be whole again." Claire stared at him. "You know how to fix a broken cup?" William's mouth twitched, the smallest hint of something that might have been amusement. "I know how to fix a broken sword. The principle is the same. Heat, pressure, patience." He stood up and crossed to a wooden cabinet in the corner where the cook kept her supplies. He rummaged for a moment and came back with a small pot of glue and a strip of linen cloth. "Sit," he said, and Claire, still kneeling on the floor, sat. "Hand me the pieces, gently." She did as he said. She handed him the pieces one by one, and he took them with surprising care, his large hands moving with a delicacy that did not match the real him. He spread a thin layer of glue along the edge of each piece, pressed them together, and held them in place while the glue set. "This is not," Claire said, watching him, "what I expected the Alpha King of Ashford to be doing on a rainy afternoon." "What did you expect?" William asked, not looking up. "I do not know," she said honestly. "Something with a sword. Or a horse. Somewhere muddy and cold." "Muddy and cold can wait until tomorrow." He pressed another piece into place, his tongue between his teeth in concentration. "A broken cup is a more immediate problem." Claire watched his hands, the way they held the fragile clay so carefully, and she thought about what Martha had told her about the silent Alpha, the man who never smiled, who had not been seen to laugh since he was a boy. She thought about the way he had stood by the window that morning, drinking his ale, unable to say what he felt. "You are not what I expected either," she said quietly. William paused. He looked at her, and for a moment the wall behind his eyes flickered, as if he was deciding whether to let her in or shut her out. Then he said, "What did you expect?" "A man who does not kneel on the floor to fix a broken cup." William looked down at the cup in his hands. The pieces were joined now, the crack visible but clean, held together by the glue and the linen strip he had wrapped around the rim. "It was not beautiful, but it was whole. It belonged to my mother," he said, and his voice was low. "The cup. It was my mother's, before it was my father's wife's. She used to drink from it every morning, and when she was ill she would hold it while she slept because it comforted her. After she died, my father could not bear to look at it. He put it away. He never spoke of it again. Claire's he averred, fistif and feed, and he gave it to me." "He gave it to you," William repeated, and there was something unreadable in his voice. "He has not given anyone anything since my mother died. Not a cup, not a word, nothing." He held the repaired cup out to her, and she took it, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. The touch was warm and dry and surprisingly gentle, and she felt something flutter in her chest that she had not felt in years. "Thank you," she said softly. William stood up, brushing the dust from his knees. "It will not hold water for a while. The glue needs to set. But it will be a cup again, one day. It will not be the same cup, but it will be a cup." "That is all any of us can hope for, I think," Claire said. "To be a cup again, even if we are not the same." William looked at her for a long moment, his gray-blue eyes unreadable. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked toward the door. "Wait," Claire said, and he stopped but did not turn around. "The soup, "I made barley soup for your father, but there is enough for two. Would you like to taste it?" She saw his shoulders stiffen. For a long moment he did not move. Then he said, without turning around, "I do not taste things." Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" "Just what I said." His voice was flat now, controlled. "I do not taste things. I cannot taste anything. It has been that way for years." He walked out of the kitchen, and Claire stood alone in the middle of the room, holding the repaired cup in her hands, staring at the doorway where he had been. She looked down at the cup, at the crack held together by glue and linen, and she thought about a man who could not taste his own food, a man who had lost his mother and now feared losing his father, a man who knelt on a stone floor to fix a broken cup, Beacom. Think it belonged to someone he loved. She set the cup gently on the windowsill, where the evening light caught the painted vines, and she went back to the stove. The soup bubbled. The rain fell. And Claire thought about how a man could lose his taste for food, and how it was never really about the food at all. The rain had stopped sometime before midnight, leaving the courtyard slick and silver under a thin moon. Claire stood at the kitchen window with the repaired cup in her hands, turning it slowly so the candlelight caught the painted vines along its rim. She had not been able to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw William's face as he said the words, "I cannot taste anything." It has been that way for years. There had been no self-pity in his voice, no plea for sympathy, just a flat, tired statement like a man describing a wall he had run into so many times he had stopped feeling the bruise. She set the cup down on the windowsill and went to the shelf where she kept her mother's recipe book. It was not much to look at. A leather-bound thing with stained pages and a broken clasp, the corners worn soft from years of handling. Her mother had written in it with a careful hand, pressing herbs between the pages until some of them were more brown than green. Claire had not opened it in weeks, not since she had come to the castle. She had been too tired, too strange in this new place with its stone walls and its silent lord and its old man who kept feathers in a wooden box. But tonight she opened it. The pages fell open to a place near the middle, where a sprig of dried thyme had been pressed so long ago that it crumbled at her touch. Beneath it, in her mother's looping script, was a recipe. She read it twice, then a third time, slowly, her lips moving without sound. The soup her mother had called the homecoming soup, the one she had made only on the coldest nights when the wind came down from the mountains and the whole village seemed to hold its breath. The one she had made the winter Claire's father died, and the winter Claire's brother had come home from the wars with a scar across his face and a silence in his eyes. Her mother had always said the same thing when she ladled it out. "A body forgets a lot of things," she would say, "but it never forgets the taste of home." Claire closed the book and held it against her chest for a moment. Then she opened it again and set to work. The kitchen was quiet at this hour. The servants had gone to their beds, the fires had been banked low, but she rebuilt them, coaxing the flames up until the big iron pot began to warm. She moved through the pantry with sure hands, onions, carrots, a turnip, a handful of dried peas. She found a marrow bone at the back of the cold larder and set it in the pot with water. She worked the way her mother had taught her, slowly, without rushing, letting each thing find its own moment. She chopped the onions fine and let them sweat in butter until they turned translucent and sweet. She added the carrots and turnips, then the bone, then the peas. She reached for the dried thyme and crushed it between her palms, letting the scent rise before she scattered it into the pot. The kitchen began to smell like her mother's kitchen, like the small stone house at the edge of Thornwood, like winter evenings when the world outside went dark early and the fire made everyone's faces golden. She was humming without realizing, the old tune her mother had hummed, the one about the shepherd who walked home through the snow. She only stopped when she heard a sound behind her. Ilium stood in the doorway. He was not wearing his armor. He wore a plain linen shirt and a pair of dark breeches, and his feet were bare. His hair was mussed, like he had been lying down and could not sleep, and he held a candle in one hand, the flame casting shadows up across his face. He looked at her. Then he looked at the pot on the stove, and his nostrils flared just slightly. "What is that?" he asked. His voice was rough with sleep. Claire's heart was beating too fast. She gripped the ladle with both hands. It's a soup, my lord. An old recipe, from my mother." He did not move from the doorway. "It smells like—" He stopped. Something passed across his face, confusion, or memory, or both. It smells like something I cannot name, he said finally. Claire swallowed. She had not planned this. She had only meant to make the soup for herself, to feel close to her mother on a night when she felt far from everything she knew. She had not meant for him to find her here, barefoot and rumpled and looking at her the way he was looking at her now. I could not sleep, she said, because she did not know what else to say. I thought I would make something. It helps me think. He took a step into the kitchen, then another. He set his candle down on the long wooden table and stood a few feet from the stove, watching the pot as it bubbled. My father is asleep, he said. He ate well tonight, the first time in days he finished a full bowl. I am glad, my lord. William, he said quietly. You can call me William. When we are here, in the kitchen, when there is no one else. Claire nodded, not trusting her voice. The word felt too heavy in her mouth. William, the name of the man who could not taste his own food. She stirred the soup. The steam rose. Curry. In think them scent of thyme and onion and marrow. She watched him breathe it in, watched the way his shoulders dropped just a little, the way he had held them stiff for so long that she had not realized until now how much tension he was carrying. It has been so long, he said, almost to himself, since I smelled anything like this. She did not ask what he meant. She was afraid if she spoke he would stop, so she stirred the soup, and she waited. William moved closer. He stood beside her at the stove, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. My mother used to make something, he said slowly. When I was a boy. In the winter. She would put in herbs she gathered herself and she would say... He stopped. His jaw tightened. She would say it was the only thing that could chase the cold out of a man's bones. Claire's hands stilled on the ladle. She looked at him, at the hard line of his mouth, at the way his eyes had gone distant, at the way he was gripping the edge of the table with his scarred left hand. She did not say anything. She simply reached for a bowl and ladled out a portion of the soup, then set it on the table in front of him. He looked at the bowl, then at her. I told you I cannot taste. I know, she said. But it is not about the tasting, is it? It is about the remembering. The words hung between them. The fire crackled. The soup sent up curls of steam, and William stared at the bowl for a long moment. Then he sat down. He picked up the spoon. He dipped it into the broth, lifted it, blew on it gently. He brought it to his lips and drank. Claire watched his face. She saw his eyes close. She saw the swallow move down his throat. She saw him sit very still. The spoon still, I would think, in his hand. Then he opened his eyes, and she saw something she had not expected. He was crying. Not much. Just a film of wetness over his gray-blue eyes, there and gone in the space of a breath. But she had seen it. It tastes of nothing, he said. His voice was hoarse. It tastes of nothing. And yet I can remember what my mother's soup tasted like. I can remember the way she laughed when I burned my tongue. I can remember the way the kitchen smelled when she was alive. He set the spoon down. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had come to this castle, he did not look like the Alpha King. He looked like a man who had been alone for a very long time and had only just realized it. Thank you, he said. I do not know how you did that, but thank you. Claire sat down across from him. She did not reach for his hand, though she wanted to. She did not say anything about the tears she had seen. She only sat with him in the warm kitchen, with the soup bubbling on the stove and the repaired cup sitting on the windowsill, catching the first gray light of dawn. They stayed like that until the sky turned pale, and the rooster crowed, and the world began to stir back to life. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. When William finally stood, he paused at the door. He looked back at her, his hand on the frame, and he said, "Will you make that soup again? For my father?" "Of course," Claire said. "It is an old recipe. It is meant to be shared." He nodded. He did not smile, but something in his face had softened, like ice beginning to thaw at the edges. He left, and Claire sat alone in the kitchen with her mother's recipe book open on the table, and the smell of thyme hanging in the air. She looked down at the page, at the loops of her mother's handwriting, at the small note at the bottom, the one she had read 100 times and never fully understood until now. For the ones who have forgotten the way home. She closed the book gently. She touched the repaired cup on the windowsill, feeling the smooth line of the crack beneath her fingers, and she thought about how a man could lose his taste for food, and how it was never really about the food at all. It was about losing the taste for being alive. And how sometimes, if you were lucky, a bowl of soup cooked at dawn in a stranger's kitchen could remind you what it felt like to want to stay. The messenger arrived at noon, mud-splashed and exhausted, his horse lathered white at the flanks. Claire was in the kitchen when she heard the commotion in the yard. Shouted orders, the clatter of hooves, the sharp ring of steel being tested. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped to the window. Below, the castle yard had transformed into something she had only heard described in hushed voices at the village well. Men in leather and mail were forming lines, banners snapped in the cold wind, and at the center of it all, William stood with his back to her, listening to the messenger with a stillness that made her chest tighten. She could not hear what was said, but she saw Bran cross himself, she saw the way the men tightened their grips on their spears, and she saw William turn, slow as winter, and look up at the kitchen window, exactly where she stood. It was the first time he had ever looked for her. The news came to her in pieces, the way news always traveled in a castle, through the serving girls, through the stable hands, through the old cook who had known every lord for 40 years and said nothing out loud but shook his head a great deal. Blackmore. The name was spoken in lowered voices, as if the walls themselves might carry it back across the border. Raids had been growing bolder for months. Grain stores burned. A shepherd found dead with his own crook through him. A village girl taken, returned 3 days later without the power of speech. That evening, Claire found Martha waiting for her by the kitchen door, wrapped in a shawl that smelled of wood smoke and disapproval. "He's going himself," Martha said without preamble. "The Lord. He's leading the men out at dawn." Claire's hands went still around the bundle of herbs she was carrying. "He's the Alpha King. He doesn't—" She stopped. She did not know what she had been about to say. "He doesn't go himself? He doesn't risk his life?" She had no right to any of those words. Martha looked at her with those sharp old eyes, the ones that saw everything, and forgave almost none of it. "Mark my words, girl. That man has been waiting for a fight for years, something to hit that isn't grief. You go careful with your heart around him." Claire said nothing. She carried the herbs inside, laid them on the table, and stood for a long time looking at the soup pot that still had the faint smell of yesterday's broth clinging to its sides. She was still awake when the knock came. It was well past midnight. The castle had settled into the uneasy quiet of men who know they must rise early and may not all come back. Claire had been sitting at the kitchen table with her mother's recipe book open to the page for the homecoming soup, though she had not read a single word of it in the past hour. She opened the door to find William standing in the dark corridor, a lantern in one hand and something small wrapped in cloth in the other. He did not step inside. He stood in the doorway, his face half in shadow, and he looked think her for a long moment before he spoke. "I have to leave at dawn," he said. "I heard Bran will stay. He'll make sure you have everything you need for my father." A pause. "And he has orders to see you safely back to the village if anything happens." Claire understood what he was not saying. "If anything happens to me." She gripped the edge of the door until her knuckles went white. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I can make my own way." "I know." He looked down at the cloth in his hand, then held it out to her. "This is for you. For the soup. The one my mother used to make. I found it in the storeroom this morning. I thought you might want it." She took the bundle. It was warm. When she unfolded the cloth, she found a small jar of honey, dark as amber, with a chip in its rim. "From the hives by the southern wall," he said. "The bees have been good this year. She always used honey in her soup. I don't know if it's the right kind, but—" "It's perfect," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Thank you, William." He flinched at his name, just slightly, and then something in his shoulders loosened. He looked past her, into the kitchen, at the low fire, and the pot on the hearth, and the recipe book open on the table. "The homecoming soup," he said. "Is that what you're making?" "I was thinking about it." "Good." He nodded. "Once. When I come back, I'd like to taste it, even if I can't." He stopped. His hand went to his left palm. The old scar, the familiar gesture she had come to recognize. "Even if I can't taste it properly, I'd still like to be there when you make it." Claire wanted to say something something true and brave and full of all the things that had been growing in her chest since the night he first came to her kitchen. But the words would not come. So, she did the only thing she could think of. She stepped forward, took his free hand in both of hers, and pressed it once, firmly, the way her mother used to do when her father left for the harvest fairs. "Then you come back," she said, "and I'll have it waiting." He looked down at their hands. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought he might say something more, but he only nodded, stepped back into the corridor and was gone. She did not sleep. She made the soup instead, in the dark hours before dawn, using his mother's honey and the herbs from her own stores. She did not know why she was making it now, when there was no one to eat it. It was as if her hands knew something her heart was not ready to admit. When the first gray light touched the window, she heard the horns. She carried the pot to the window and watched him go, the column of riders, the banners snapping in the wind, William at the head with his black cloak and his sword shining dully in the pale morning. He did not look back. She stood there until the last horse disappeared into the tree line. Then she set the pot on the hearth to keep warm, and she went to see Lord Edgar. The old man was awake when she came in. He lay propped against his pillows, his gray hair loose on his shoulders, and he was holding something in his hand, a dark feather, worn and soft with age. "Gone, then," he said, without looking at her. "Yes, my lord." "Good." He turned the feather over in his fingers. "He's been too long in this castle. A man needs to remember what he's protecting." He looked at her then, and his eyes were sharper than she had expected. "You're the one who makes the soup." "I am." "Bring it here." He gestured to the chair by his bed. "Sit. Tell me what you put in it." Claire sank think. He told him, and as she spoke, he listened and occasionally nodded, and once, just once, he smiled. A thin, dry smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Thyme," he said. "My wife used thyme. William doesn't know that. He was too young to remember the pot by the time she—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "He thinks he's lost his taste. He doesn't know he lost it the day she died." Claire's hands stilled in her lap. "Lost his taste? He can't taste anything, hasn't for years. He thinks it's a wound from the war, or some sickness, but I know my son." Edgar looked down at the feather. When his mother died, he stopped tasting everything: food, wine, honey, life. A long pause. "He's been swallowing bitterness for 15 years and calling it strength." Claire sat very still. She thought about the honey jar in her kitchen. She thought about the way William had said, "Even if I can't taste it properly, I'd still like to be there." "He asked me to make the homecoming soup," she said quietly, "for when he comes back." Edgar's head lifted. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he let out a breath that was half laugh and half something else. "Did he now?" He shook his head slowly. "That boy hasn't asked for anything in 15 years. He reached out and took her hand, his grip dry and warm and surprisingly strong. "You bring him back, girl. You bring him back and you feed him that soup, and maybe—" He stopped, and his eyes went distant. "Maybe he'll finally taste something again." Claire left Edgar's room with her heart full of things she had no name for, but when she stepped into the corridor, Bran was waiting for her, his face gray. "My lady," he said, "the physician is with Lord Edgar. He's asking to speak with you." The physician was a small man with tired eyes and thin hand that smelled of bitter herbs. He spoke to Claire in the antechamber, his voice low and careful, the way men speak when they do not want to be overheard. "It's his lungs," the physician said, "an old wound from the border wars 30 years past. The scar has never healed properly. It's been growing worse this autumn." "How much worse?" The physician hesitated. "He has months, my lady, perhaps less if the cold settles in. The Lord does not know. I have not told him. He would not listen anyway." He looked at her with something like pleading. "But I thought you should know. He trusts you. He told me so himself." Claire stood in the cold corridor and felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. William was riding to war, and his father was dying, and she was just a widow from the Thornwood who made soup. But she had made soup that had reminded a man what his mother's kitchen smelled like. She had held his hand in the dark and told him to come back. She straightened her shoulders. "Thank you," she said to the physician. "I'll keep it to myself." She walked back to the kitchen. The pot of homecoming soup was still warm on the hearth. She lifted the lid and watched the steam rise. And she thought about the honey and the thyme and the feather and the man who had forgotten how to taste. Then she sat down at the table, opened her mother's recipe book, and began to write. She wrote down everything she knew, the herbs, the measurements, the way the soup should smell at each stage. She wrote it not for herself, but for the day when William would come back and she would need to make it perfect. And she wrote at the bottom in her own hand, beneath her mother's note, "For the one who has forgotten his way home." 7 days passed with no word from the border. Claire told herself she was not counting. She told herself that the soup she reheated each evening was simply for Lord Edgar, that the extra portion she set aside was habit, nothing more. But every night she lifted the lid of the pot and watched the steam rise. And every night she thought of a man who had promised to come back and taste it. On the 7th night, Bran came through the kitchen door without knocking. His face was gray beneath the torchlight. His tunic was torn at the shoulder and there was blood on his hands, dark and drying. He did not speak at first. He stood in the doorway and let her see the weight of what he carried in his eyes. "The Alpha," he said. "He's back. He's hurt." Claire's hands went still on the ladle. For a moment she did not breathe. Then she set the ladle down, wiped her hands on her apron, and followed him out into the cold. The courtyard was chaos. Torches flared and guttered in the wind. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath pluming white. Men moved in the half-dark, carrying saddles and spears, calling to one another in low, tired voices. And in the middle of it all, on a stretcher made of spears and cloaks, lay William of House Ashford. He was unconscious. His face was pale beneath the dirt and the dried blood, and his right shoulder was wrapped in a crude bandage that had soaked through. His left arm hung at an odd angle, the sleeve of his tunic dark and stiff. Claire stopped at the edge of the torchlight, and for one terrible moment she could not make herself go closer because she had stood in a courtyard like this before. She had stood in the cold and the torchlight and watched them carry a man she loved on a stretcher, and that man had not woken up. But William's chest rose. She saw it, a small movement beneath the bloodied cloak, and she flipped down that she could move again. "Bring him inside," she said, and her voice was steady. "The east chamber, the one with the big hearth. Bran, send for the physician. Someone bring hot water, as much as you can carry." They carried him up the stairs. Claire walked beside the stretcher, her hand on the edge of the wood, as if she could hold him steady by touch alone. She did not think about the last time she had walked beside a stretcher. She did not allow herself to think about it. There would be time for that later. She told herself there would be time for all of it later. The east chamber was warm when they brought him in. The fire had been lit hours ago for the old lord, and the heat wrapped around them like a blanket. They laid William on the bed, and Claire pushed her way to his side and began to cut away his tunic. The physician arrived, a man called Aldrich, gray-haired and steady-handed, who had tended the wounds of Ashford men for 40 years. He worked in silence, and Claire worked with him. She held the bowl of water. She tore the linen into strips. She held William's hand steady while Aldrich set the shoulder back into its socket. William's eyes flew open. He made no sound, but his whole body went rigid, and his hand closed around Claire's with a force that made her gasp. For a moment, he looked at her, and she thought she saw something in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or relief, or both. Then the darkness took him again, and his grip loosened, and he was still. Aldrich worked until well past midnight. He stitched the wound on William's left arm, a deep gash that had gone down to the bone. He bound the shoulder, and he said the arrow had gone through clean, and that if the fever did not take him, he would live. "Fever," Claire repeated. "You think it will come?" "It always does," Aldrich said. He looked at her with tired eyes. "You know how to bring a fever down?" "Yes," she said. "I know." She knew. She had done it before, in a cottage at the edge of the woods with a man who had come home from the fields with a fever in his lungs. She had done it for 3 days and 3 nights, and she had lost him anyway. But that was different. That was different, and she would not think about it now. Aldrich left. Bran lingered by the door, his hand on the hilt of his sword, looking at his lord with an expression Claire could not quite read. Then he nodded to her, once, and went out. The door closed behind him. Claire was alone with William of House Ashford. She worked through the night. She changed the cloths on his forehead. She held the cup of water to his lips when he stirred and muttered. She watched the fire and kept it burning steady. She told herself she was doing what anyone would do. She told herself this was no different from tending any sick man, any wounded man, any man at all. But when she sat down in the chair beside the bed, and when she watched the firelight move across his face, she knew she was lying to herself. He was not any man. He was the man who had given her a jar of honey and asked her to wait for him. He was the man who had promised to come back and taste her soup. He was the man who had stood in her kitchen and told her in his quiet, stubborn way that he did not know how to be gentle, and she had told him to come back. She had told him she would wait. She waited. The fever came at dawn. It came hard, as fevers do with strong men who have never learned to be weak. His skin burned under her hands. He thrashed in the bed and he muttered words she could not understand, words that might have been names or curses older up the queers. She held him down when she had to, and she held him still when she could, and she talked to him in a low, steady voice. "You're all right," she said. "You're home. You're safe. Just hold on." He opened his eyes once in the middle of the morning. His gaze found her face and something in it softened. His lips moved and she leaned close to hear. "Mother?" Claire's throat tightened. "No," she said gently. "No, my lord." "It's Claire. It's the cook." He blinked. For a moment, he seemed to come back to himself. Then his eyes focused on her and he said very clearly, "You're still here." "I said I would wait," she said. He closed his eyes and a small sound escaped him. Not a word, not quite a sigh, something that might have been relief. And then the fever took him under again. It broke near midday. She was sitting by the window, wringing out a cloth in the basin when she heard him stir. She turned. He was awake. His eyes were open and he was looking at her with an expression she could not name. His face was still pale, but the terrible heat had gone out of his skin, and his breathing was deep and even. "How long?" he asked. His voice was rough, scraped raw. "A day and a night," she said. "You gave us a fright." He looked at his bandaged shoulder, at his arm, at the room around him. Then he looked back at her. "You stayed." "I said I would wait," she said again. It felt like the only thing she knew how to say. The fire crackled. A log settled in the hearth. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the shutters. He moved his left hand and she saw him wince. The bandage on his arm had come loose. She crossed the room without thinking, sat down on the edge of the bed and began to rewrap it. He watched her work. He did not pull away and he did not speak. She could think his eyes on her hands, on her face, on the small, careful movements she made with the linen. And when she finished, she did not get up. She sat there, her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at him. "Your left hand," she said quietly. "I saw the scar, the one that runs across your palm. I saw it when I held your hand steady last night." He was silent for a long moment. She thought he would not answer. Then he said very low, "It's old." "I know it's old," she said. "I know it's not from this fight. I saw it before you left." He looked at her. His gray-blue eyes were tired, but there was something in them, something careful and guarded. "I was 16, he said. "My father took me on his first border campaign. We were ambushed in the pass. He went down and I went to pull him up. A Blackmore swordsman caught me across the hand." Claire looked at the scar, the long white line that ran from the base of his thumb to the edge of his palm. "You saved him." "I was too slow," William said. "He took the wound before I got him up. I've carried the scar ever since, to remind me that I was too slow." "Your father is alive," Claire said. "He is upstairs, breathing, because you pulled him out of that pass. You were not too slow. You were fast enough." William said nothing. His jaw tightened, and he looked away, toward the fire. Claire did not push. She stood, fetched the cup of water from the table, and held it to his lips. He drank, and she set the cup down, and she sat back down in the chair beside the bed. "Your father asked me to bring you home," she said. "He said you'd forgotten how to taste. He said you forgot the day your mother died." William went very still. "He shouldn't have told you that," he said. His voice was flat. "Maybe not," she said. "But he did. And I think, my lord, that he was trying to tell you something he doesn't know how to say. He's proud of you. He's afraid for you. He wants you to remember what it feels like to want something." William closed his eyes. For a long moment he did not speak. The fire crackled. The wind rattled the shutters. "When I was 16, he said at last, "I thought if I was strong enough, I could keep everyone safe. I thought if I didn't let myself feel anything, I couldn't lose anything. I thought that was what it meant to be a man." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "I was wrong," he said. "I've known I was wrong. For a long time, I just didn't know how to stop." Claire reached out and took his hand, the one with the old scar, very gently in both of hers. "You don't have to stop all at once," she said. "You just have to let someone stand with you while you learn." He looked at her hand on his. He looked at her face, and for the first time since she had known him, William of House Ashford smiled. A small, tired, crooked thing, but real. "I made you a promise," he said. "I said I'd come back and taste your soup." "You did come back," she said. "I did," he said, "and I intend to keep the rest of it. Just give me a day or two to remember how to sit up." Claire laughed. It came out wet, and she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and she laughed again. "I'll keep the soup warm," she said. She did not let go of his hand, and he did not pull away. The days after William came home were quiet in a way Claire had almost forgotten. He slept more than he admitted. He ate what she put in front of him, without complaint, which she had learned was his way of saying thank you. And every afternoon, when she went up to sit with Lord Edgar, William found a reason to be in the doorway, leaning on his key, pretending to check the window latch, pretending he had somewhere else to be. She did not call him out on it. Some things did not need to be said aloud. On the fourth morning, the wind changed. It came down from the mountains cold and dry, and it did not stop. Claire felt it pulling at her skirts as she carried water from the well, felt it in the way the thatch on the roof seemed to whisper and shift above her head. Martha stood in her own doorway, squinting at the sky, and she did not say "mark my words" even once, which Claire had learned meant she was worried. "It's been dry a long while," Martha said finally. "Too dry. A wind like this and one careless spark is all it takes." Claire nodded. She thought about the hearth fires in every home in the village, the forge at the edge of the green, the torches along the castle walls. She thought about how thin the line was between a warm kitchen and an inferno. She did not know, then, how soon she would be standing on the wrong side of that line. The fire started at noon, in the old co-opers' shed at the far end of the village. A spark from his forge, a pile of dry shavings, and the wind did the rest. By the time the first cry went up, the flames were already leaping from one roof to the next, snapping and roaring like something alive and hungry. Claire was in the kitchen when she heard it. She had been chopping roots for the evening broth, and the sound that came through the window was not like any weather she had ever heard. It was a sound that had lived in her chest for years, the crack of wood giving way, the roar of a fire that had stopped asking permission. Her hands went still. The knife clattered to the table. She was out the door before she knew she had moved, running toward the smoke with her skirts hiked up and her lungs already burning from the ash in the air. The village was chaos. People running with buckets, children crying, a man shouting for his brother, a woman carrying a screaming infant toward the river. The wind drove the flames down the lane like a pack of wolves, and Claire's heart slammed against her ribs as she counted the roofs still standing. Then she counted again. The smoke was thickest around the old stone house at the edge of the green, the house with the herb garden. The house where Lord Edgar of Ashford lay in his bed, too weak to walk, too stubborn to be carried. "No," Claire breathed. "No, no, no." She ran. She did not stop to think about what a widow from Thornwood was doing running into a burning house. She did not stop to think about the fact that she had already lost one man to the fire, that she had spent years telling herself she would never run into a burning building again. She just ran, because there was a man in that bed who had called her "my dear" and meant it, and because she had promised herself she would not lose another one. The heat hit her like a wall when she pushed through the door. Smoke curled along the ceiling, thick and black, and the old beams groaned above her head. She dropped to her knees and crawled, one hand on the floorboards, one hand pressed over her mouth, following the path she had walked every afternoon for weeks. She found him in the bed, half sitting, coughing into his fist, his eyes red and streaming. "Lord Edgar!" She crawled to the bedside and grabbed his hand. "We have to go. Now." He looked at her with those fierce old eyes, and for a moment she thought he would argue, would tell her he had lived through worse, would order her to save herself. But then he coughed again, a deep, rattling sound, and he closed his fingers around her wrist with a grip that surprised her. "The feather," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "On the table? I won't leave without it." Claire looked. On the little wooden table beside his bed, among the medicine cups and the clean cloths, lay a single gray feather, worn soft at the edges, the quill yellowed with age. She had noticed it before and never asked. She knew enough to know that some things were not hers to ask about. She grabbed it, tucked it into the bodice of her dress, and turned back to him. "Now," she said, "hold on to me and don't let go." He was lighter than she expected. The fever and the long winter had eaten away at what had once been a broad, strong frame, and he leaned against her like a child as she hauled him upright and half-carried him toward the door. The smoke was worse now, and she could feel the heat pressing in from the roof, could hear the crack of timber somewhere behind her. She did not look back. She did not let go. They burst out of the door together, stumbling into the cold, ash-filled air, and Claire gasped so hard she thought her lungs would tear. Edgar was coughing, leaning on her, and she was shaking, and the whole village was shouting. And then there were hands on her, strong hands, pulling her back, and a voice she knew, rough and afraid, cutting through the roar of the flames. "Claire, Claire, look at me." It was William. He was standing in front of her in his shirt, no cloak, no crutch, his bandaged arm held stiff against his chest, his face white with something that was not just the smoke. He had come down from the castle. He had come running. "I'm all right," she managed. "Your father." "He's all right. I got him out." William looked past her at the old man leaning against the well, coughing and Think. Don't think. All of the door for the time what made a speeder's cup, the moments a pause to the sooth installer, Claude, Glosday. Wild. Oh, the scene that she would know them. He could sop a mirnas makes chakant, so I know what I was. Sim. I was eco-line. So my father. Yes, she said. For my father. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that she could not name. It was not anger. It was not relief. It was something older and more fragile. Something that looked like a man realizing he had been holding his breath for years and had only just remembered how to breathe. "You could have died." He said. "I didn't," she said. The fire was still roaring behind them, but the bucket line was working now, and the flames had not reached the next house. Someone was shouting for water. Someone else was crying. Martha was suddenly there, her gray hair wild, her face streaked with soot, her hands shaking as she grabbed Claire's shoulders and looked her over. "You foolish, brave, stubborn woman," Martha said, and her voice cracked. "You ran into that house. You ran straight into it." "I had to," Claire said. Martha's face crimpled. She pulled Claire into a rough embrace, and Claire felt the old woman's body shaking against hers. "The fire took your man," Martha said, her voice muffled against Claire's shoulder. "The fire took him from you, and you still ran. You still ran straight into it." Claire went very still. William was standing a few feet away, and she could feel his eyes on her. She could feel the weight of what Martha had just said settling into the air between them. The thing she had never told him. The thing she had never told anyone. "The first fire," Martha said, pulling back, her eyes wet. "The big one, years ago. That's where her husband died. He went back, were a neighbor's child, and the roof came down on him. She was the one who found him. She was the one who pulled him out, and he was already gone." Claire closed her eyes. The memory came up like smoke, thick and choking. The heat, the roar, the body in her arms, too still, too heavy. The face she had loved and would never see again. "I never told you," she said, and she did not know if she was speaking to Martha or to William. "I never told anyone. I thought if I said it out loud it would be real all over again." William stepped forward. He did not reach for her. He stood very close, close enough that she could see the ash on his brow, the raw look in his eyes, the way his jaw was working as he tried to find the words. "How long ago?" he asked. 7 years, she said. 7 years ago this winter. And you still ran into a burning house? "I couldn't watch someone else I loved die," she said. And the words came out before she could stop them. "I couldn't stand there and watch the fire take someone else. The silence between them was full of the crack of burning wood and the shouting of the bucket line. William reached out slowly and took her hand, the one with the soot, the one she had used to hold his father's weight. He held it gently, carefully, like it was something precious. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry you had to do that alone." Claire looked at him, at this man who had spent his whole life learning not to feel, and she saw that he understood. He understood because he had carried his own weight alone for so long, because he had learned that showing fear was the same as showing weakness, because he had spent years believing that no one would catch him if he fell. "Your father is alive," she said. "That's what matters. I got him out." "You got him out? Wilshire?" Liam repeated. He looked at the old man by the well, coughing and alive, and then he looked back at Claire. "You saved him, and I'd do it again," she said. "For him, for you, I'd do it again." The fire burned through the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. By the time it was out, the Copers' shed was gone, and the 2 houses beside it, but the rest of the village had been saved. Lord Edgar was carried up to the castle on a stretcher, coughing but alive, and Claire walked beside him with his feather still tucked against her heart. William walked behind them. He did not speak, but when Claire stumbled on the steep path, his hand was there, steady under her elbow, and he did not let go until they reached the gate. That night in the kitchen, Claire sat alone with a cup of cold tea and watched the embers in the hearth. Her hands were shaking. They had been shaking since she ran out of that house, and she was not sure they would ever stop. The door opened. William came in, moving carefully, his bandaged arm held close, his face tired in the firelight. He did not say anything. He just crossed the room, took the chair across from her, and sat down. They sat like that for a long time. "The feather," William said finally. "He asked me about it once, years ago. I never knew what it meant." Claire reached into her bodice and drew it out. It was warm from her skin, soft in her fingers, the gray vein worn thin at the edges. "He said he wouldn't leave without it," she said. "He said it like it was the most important thing in the world." William looked at the feather in her hand. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, softened. "It was my mother's," he said. "She kept it in a box by their bed. He's never let it go since the day she died." Claire's throat tightened. She held the feather out to him and he took it, turning it over in his fingers with a tenderness she had never seen him show for anything. "You should keep it for him," she said. "He'll want it when he wakes." William nodded. He closed his fingers around the feather, and then he looked at her, and she saw that his eyes were wet. "You could have died today," he said again. "So could you," she said. "You came down the mountain with a broken arm and no cloak." He almost smiled. It was not the full smile she had seen the other night, but it was there, a small, tired thing. "I heard the fire," he said. "I heard the shouting, and I thought—" He stopped. He looked down at the feather in his hand. "I thought about all the things I never said to my father. I thought about all the things I never said to you." Claire reached across the table and took his hand, the one holding the feather, and held it between both of hers. "You can say them now," she said. "He's alive. We're alive. You can say them now." William looked at her hand on his. He looked at the fire. He looked at the window, where the smoke still hung in gray ribbons over the village. "I don't know how," he said. "Then I'll wait," she said. "I've gotten good at waiting." The fire crackled. The wind had died, and the night was still. And somewhere, up in the castle, an old man was alive, because a widow from Thornwood had run into a burning house without stopping to think. William did not let go of her hand, and for the first time in a long, long time, he let himself believe that maybe he did not have to carry everything alone. The morning came gray and cold, and the smoke from the burned village still hung low over the valley like a bruise on the sky. Claire was in the kitchen when Bran found her. His face was pale and his hands were shaking as he gripped the doorframe. "My lord," he said, and then stopped. He swallowed. "The old Lord Edgar. He cannot breathe. The healer says it is the smoke. His lungs, they are failing." Claire set down the ladle she was holding. She did not run. She walked, very steadily, because she knew that if she ran, she would not stop shaking, and someone in that castle needed her to be steady. She found William in his father's chamber, standing at the foot of the bed like a man who had forgotten how to move. Edgar lay propped on pillows, his face the color of old ash. each breath a wet, rattling struggle that filled the whole room. "He will not let me send for the priest," William said. Without turning around, his voice was flat, empty. "He says he has lived through worse." Claire came to stand beside him. She looked at the old man in the bed, and she looked at the son standing over him, and she saw the same stubbornness in both of them, the same refusal to bend. "He has," she said quietly, "but that does not mean me is not afraid." William turned to look at her then, and for a moment he was not the Alpha King. He was a boy, standing in a doorway, watching his mother die, and he did not know what to do with his hands. "I don't know what to do," he said. The words came out rough, like they had been scraped from somewhere deep. "I have commanded armies. I have held this valley against every enemy who came for it, and I cannot fix this." Claire reached out and took his hand, the one with the scar. She held it the way she had held it last night, in the kitchen, when the fire was still smoldering in the distance. "You are not supposed to fix it," she said. "You are supposed to be here. That is all." The healer came and ain't. He gave Edgar a draught for the pain, and the old man slept for a while, but his breathing did not ease. Claire stayed. She sent Bran to the village for a bundle of dried thyme from her pantry, and she set a pot of water to boil over the fire in the kitchen below. William found her there an hour later, standing over the pot, adding pinches of this and that from the small jars she had brought with her. He stood in the doorway and watched her. "What are you doing?" he asked. Claire did not look up. "There is a recipe my mother left me. She called it the homecoming soup. She made it for my father when he was dying and for me when I was sick as a child. It is not a cure, but it is a comfort." William came closer. He stood on the other side of the table, watching her hands move. "You made it for my father, the night you first came." "I did," he told me. "He said it tasted like something he had not tasted in years." Claire paused. She looked at him then, and there was something careful in her eyes. "He is not the only one in this castle who has forgotten what things taste like," she said. The words hung between them. William's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "You know," he said. "It was not a question. I have known since the night of the broken bowl. You did not taste the soup I made for your father. You said it was good, but you did not taste it. I saw your face." William was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I have not tasted anything since my mother died. Not really. Not food, not wine, not—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I thought it was a punishment for not being strong enough to save her." Claire set down the spoon. She came around the table and stood in front of him, close enough that he could see the small scar on her chin, the one still she had gotten as a child falling from a tree. "You were a boy," she said. "You were a boy, and you lost your mother. That is not something to be punished for. That is something to be held." William's breath caught. He looked at her, and his eyes were bright, and he did not say anything, but he did not pull away. The soup took the rest of the morning. Claire moved through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had done this 1,000 times, and William stayed. He did not help. He did not know how, but he stayed and he watched, and when she asked him to hold the pot steady while she stirred, he did. When it was done, Claire ladled a bowl and carried it up the stairs. William followed. Edgar was awake when they entered. His eyes were sunken, and his breathing was still labored, but he turned his head when the door opened, and he saw his son standing in the doorway with the widow from the village. "You brought her," Edgar said. His voice was a whisper, but it carried. "You brought her to my bedside." William did not answer. He came to the bed and helped his father sit up slightly, propping the pillows behind him. Claire set the bowl on the bedside table and sat down in the chair that had been there for days. "It is the soup from before," she said. "The one you liked." Edgar looked at the bowl. Then he looked at her. "You remembered." "I remember everything," Claire said. "That is both my blessing and my curse." Edgar laughed, a thin, rattling sound. "You sound like my wife." He reached out and his hand found the pocket of his nightshirt. He pulled out a single gray feather, the one Claire had saved from the fire. "She gave me this the first time she let me kiss her. I have kept it for 40 years. William made a sound. It was small, barely audible, but see. Claire heard it. She looked at him and she saw that he was holding the other feather, the one she had pulled from the burning house, the pair. "She had 2 of them," Edgar said, looking at his son. "She kept one and she gave me one. I did not know you had the other." "Claire saved it," William said. His voice was rough. "From the fire, she went into the fire for it." Edgar looked at Claire. His eyes were wet. You went into a burning house for a feather. It was not a feather, Claire said. It was a promise, and promises are worth more than houses. Edgar drank the soup slowly. Claire held the bowl for him, and William sat on the edge of the bed, and for a while no one spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the old man's labored breathing. When the bowl was empty, Edgar set his hand on Claire's. You have a kind heart, he said. Do not let this old house harden it. I will not, Claire said. Edgar looked at his son. William, father, stop standing there like a stone. Sit down. Hold my hand if you want to. I will not break any faster for it. William sat. He took his father's hand, the one still holding the feather, and he held it. And then, very slowly, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead to his father's hand. I was so afraid, William said. His voice cracked. I was so afraid of losing you that I forgot to be with you. I forgot to say it now, Edgar said. I am listening. William's shoulders shook. I love you. I have always loved you. I tried to be strong because I thought that was what you wanted. I thought, if I was strong enough, I would never have to feel this. Edgar reached up and put his hand on his son's head. I never wanted you strong, he said. I wanted you alive. I wanted you whole. Strength is not the same as whole. Think me as boy. You have been strong for so long you forgot how to be anything else. Claire stood up quietly. She moved to the door to give them the room, but William reached out and caught her hand. Stay, he said, please. She stayed. The afternoon passed. Edgar slept, and William sat by the bed holding his father's hand. Claire moved between the kitchen and the chamber, keeping the fire going, keeping the soup warm, keeping the silence gentle. It was near dusk when Edgar's breathing changed. It became shallower, quicker. The healer was sent for, but Claire knew, and she saw that William knew too. William stood up. His hands were shaking. No, he said. Not yet. Not yet. Claire came to him. She took his face in her hands and made him look at her. Listen to me, she said. You have said what you needed to say. He heard you. He knows. Whatever happens now, he knows. William's eyes were wet. I am not ready. None of us are ever ready, Claire said. But you are not alone. You do not have to carry this alone. William looked at her, and then, very slowly, he let himself lean into her. He let himself be held. Stay with me, he said. Please, just stay. I am not going anywhere, Claire said. I have been waiting for you to ask. Edgar did not die that night. He held on, the way he had held on to everything in his life, stubbornly, fiercely, past the point where anyone thought he could. By morning, his breathing had steadied. The healer said it was a miracle. Claire said nothing. She simply went down to the kitchen and made another pot of soup. William found her there, standing over the fire, humming an old tune under her breath. She did not hear him come in. She did not notice him until he was standing right beside her. You hum when you cook, he said. Claire Ju, I do not. You do. You have done it every time I have watched you. Claire's cheeks went pink. That is not something I do. William almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a twitch at the corner of his mouth, but it was there. You do, he said. And it is a good sound. Claire looked at him. Your father is going to live. I know. You are going to have to learn to eat soup without me, she said. Or with me. I do not know what I am saying. William reached out and took her hand, the one with the burned scar from the fire. He turned it over and looked at it, and then he lifted it to his lips and kissed the palm. Stay, he said. Stay in this castle. Stay in the kitchen. Stay with me. Claire's breath caught. William, I have spent my whole life being strong, he said. I have spent my whole life not needing anyone. And then you walked into my kitchen with a pot of soup, and you did not ask for anything, and you did not expect anything, and you just fed my father. You fed me. You fed something in me that I had forgotten was alive. He let go of her hand and reached up to touch her face very gently, like she was something precious. I need you, he said. I am telling you because you said you would wait, and I do not want you to wait anymore. I need you, Claire. Not to cook for me, not to save my father, just you. I need you. Claire was crying. She did not know when she had started. You cannot say that to me, she whispered. I have been so afraid of losing someone again that I forgot how to let anyone in. I know what you lost, William said. Martha told me. The fire. Your husband. You pulled him out of a burning house and he was already... Stop, Claire said. Please. Claire, he was already gone, she said. Her voice broke. I pulled him out and he was already gone. And I have never been able to let myself love anyone since, because I cannot. I cannot watch someone I love die again." William pulled her into his arms. He held her, and she cried into his chest, and he did not let go. "Then we will be afraid together," he said. "I am afraid too. I have been afraid my whole life. But I would rather be afraid with you than safe alone." Claire looked up at him. Her face was wet, and her hair was coming loose from its pins, and she was the most beautiful thing William had ever seen. "I would rather be afraid with you too," she said. And then, because there was nothing else to say, and because they had both been waiting for so long, William leaned down and kissed her. It was not a grand kiss. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was the kind of kiss two people share when they have stopped running from each other, when they have stopped running from themselves. It tasted like soup and smoke and tears and home. And William tasted it. He tasted her. Later, much later, they sat in the kitchen together. The fire had burned low, and the pot of soup sat cooling on the table, and William held Claire's hand across the wood. "Can you taste it now?" she asked the soup. William picked up his spoon. He took a sip, and then he looked at her, and his eyes were bright with something that was not quite a smile. "No," he said, "not the soup." Claire's face fell. "But I can taste you," William said, "and that is enough. That is more than enough." Claire laughed, a wet, startled sound. "You are terrible at compliments." "I am terrible at everything except loving you," he said. "And I am learning that too." The fire crackled. The night was quiet, and somewhere upstairs, an woman was sleeping with a gray feather clutched in his hand, dreaming of a woman he had loved 40 years ago, and of the widow who had taught his son that strength was not the same as wholeness. Claire leaned across the table and kissed him again, and William, who had not tasted anything for 20 years, tasted home. The snow melted in the first week of March, and with it went the last of the winter's silence. Claire noticed it on the morning she walked up the castle path with her basket of dried herbs. The air had turned soft and wet, and the icicles that had hung from the stable roof all winter were dripping in steady, patient beats. She paused at the gate, tilted her face up, and let the sun sit on her cheeks for a long moment. She had not realized how long the winter had been, not in days, but in the way her heart had learned to hold two kinds of waiting: the waiting for Edgar to wake each morning, and the waiting for William to come in from the cold. He came now, as if the sun had called him too. She heard his boots on the stone before she saw him, and when she turned, he was standing in the shadow of the gate, with a bundle of firewood in his arms and a look on his face that was almost shy. "You are early," he said. "The herbs won't dry themselves," she said. And Martha said the kitchen roof leaked again. It did not leak. It dripped. There is a difference. Claire raised an eyebrow. "I have seen the bucket." William set the firewood down and came to stand beside her. He did not touch her, not here, not in the open, where the guards could see, but he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. And that was its own kind of touch. "Edgar is better," he said quietly. "He sat up this morning and asked for his hunting gloves." "That is a good sign." "It is a terrifying sign," William said. "He wants to go hawking." Claire laughed, and the sound of it surprised her. It was a full, open laugh, the kind she had not made in years. William looked at her, and something in his face softened, the way it always did when she laughed, as if he were memorizing the sound. "Do not laugh," he said. "He will have me carrying him up the hill on a litter." "Then you will carry him," she said, "and he will pretend he does not enjoy it." William shook his head, but he was almost smiling. He picked up the firewood again and nodded toward the kitchen door. "Come, I will build the fire. You can tell me what you are making that smells like spring." She had not thought he noticed the smell. She had been drying mint and early nettles, and the kitchen was thick with the green, hopeful scent of things waking up. But of course he noticed. He noticed everything she did, even when she thought he was not looking. They walked into the kitchen together, and for a moment neither of them spoke. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that settles between two people who have learned that words are not always necessary. Claire set her basket on the long wooden table and began to sort the herbs, and William moved to the hearth and knelt to build the fire. He was still terrible at it. She watched him out of the corner of her eye as he arranged the kindling too tightly, then too loosely, then muttered something under his breath and rearranged it again. His hands, which had held a sword through 100 battles, fumbled with the small, patient work of making a flame catch. "You are going to burn your fingers," she said. "I have burned them 3 times this month," he admitted. "The cook has started leaving a bucket of water by the hearth. The cook is a wife. Think, woman. The cook is afraid of you," William said. "She told me you have opinions about soup." Claire smiled. "I do have opinions about soup." "I know," he said. "I have heard them." He finally got the fire going, a small, steady flame that licked at the kindling and caught. He sat back on his heels, looking satisfied, and Claire felt something warm and quiet settle in her chest. This, she thought, this is what it is to be seen. She did not say it. She did not need to. She reached into her basket and pulled out a small bundle of dried mint, and she held it out to him. "Crush this," she said, "for the tea." William took the bundle and looked at it with the serious concentration of a man who had never crushed mint in his life. "How much?" "Until it smells like mint," she said. "You will know when you get there." He frowned at the bundle, and Claire turned back to her herbs, tied her smile. She heard him start to crush the leaves, slowly, carefully, and then pause. "It smells," he said. "That is the point. No, I mean—" He paused again. "It smells like something. I cannot name it. But it smells like something." Claire's hands stilled over the herbs. She turned to look at him, and he was staring at the crushed mint in his palm with an expression she had never seen before, wonder, pure and unguarded. "William," she said softly, "can you smell it?" He looked up at her, and his eyes were bright. "I can smell the mint, and the smoke, and—" He closed his eyes, and a small, puzzled frown crossed his face. "There is something else, something green, like the grass after rain." Claire crossed the kitchen and took his hand in hers. She brought it to her nose and breathed in the crushed mint, the smoke, the faint green smell of early spring. "That is the world," she said. "It's been there all along. You just could not reach it." William turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. He did not say anything for a long moment. He just stood there, holding her hand, breathing in the smell of mint and spring, and Claire watched the wonder settle into something quieter, something like peace. "Can you taste it?" she asked. "The tea, I mean." He shook his head slowly. "Not yet, but I can smell it. That is more than I have had in 20 years. Claire squeezed his hand. "Then we have time," she said. "We have all the time in the world." They stood there for a long moment, the fire crackling, the mint drying on the table, the spring light falling through the window in long golden bars. And then there was a voice from the doorway, dry and familiar. "Is this what passes for work in my castle now?" They turned. Lord Edgar was standing in the doorway, leaning on a carved walking stick, a gray feather tucked into the collar of his tunic. His face was thinner than it had been before the fire, and there were new lines around his mouth, but his eyes were sharp and very much alive. "Father," William said, and there was a warmth in his voice that had not been there 6 months ago. "You should be in bed." "I have been in bed for 6 months," Edgar said. "I have seen every crack in that ceiling. I have counted them. There are 43. I am done with ceilings." He walked into the kitchen, slowly, carefully, and Claire moved to pull out a chair for him. He waved her off and sat down on his own with the stubborn pride of a man who had spent his whole life refusing help. "You are crushing mint," he said, looking at William. "I did not know you knew what mint was." "I am learning," William said. Edgar looked at Claire and his eyes crinkled. "You hectares." "Being off something to him," he said. "He is almost pleasant." "Almost," Claire said. "I am still working on the rest." Edgar laughed, a rusty creaking sound, and William shook his head, but he was smiling. It was a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes, and Claire felt her heart turn over in her chest. She had done this. She had helped bring this man back to his father and his father back to him. She had watched a family find its way back to each other over a bowl of soup. She turned to the hearth and began to fill the pot with water. The morning stretched out in front of her, full of small, ordinary tasks. Tea to make, herbs to sort, a fire to tend, and 2 men at the table behind her arguing gently about whether the mint was ready. This, she thought, this is what it is to be home. The weeks passed and spring settled into the valley like a slow green tide. Claire came to the castle every morning now. It had happened so gradually that she could not say when it had become a habit, the walk up the hill, the basket of herbs, the fire already burning when she arrived. William was always there, always learning some new thing, always failing at it with a stubbornness that made her want to laugh and kiss him in equal measure. He had learned to boil water without burning it. He had learned to chop onions, though he cried the whole time and swore it was the onions and not the memories. He had learned to stir a pot without splashing soup onto the hearth, which Claire privately considered a miracle. He had not learned to make soup. That, he admitted, was beyond him. "Your soup tastes like longing," he said one evening, watching her stir the pot. "Mine tastes like regret." "Regret is a good base," Claire said. "You just need to add more salt." William snorted, but he'd pick to think up the salt and added a pinch to his own pot, which was, as far as Claire could tell, a pot of boiled water with some sad floating vegetables. She did not tell him that. He was trying, and trying was its own kind of love. Edgar had recovered enough to walk the length of the castle walls. He did it every morning, slowly with his walking stick, and he always stopped at the same place, the East Tower, where the view looked out over the valley toward the Thornwood village. He would stand there for a long time, the gray feather in his hand, and Claire knew he was not looking at the valley. He was looking at a memory. She did not ask him about it. She did not need to. She had her own memories, and she had learned that some things could not be spoken, only carried. But one morning Edgar found her in the kitchen, and he did something he had never done before. He reached into his tunic and pulled out the gray feather, and he held it out to her. "I want you to have this," he said. Claire stared at the feather. "Lord Edgar." "Edgar," he said firmly. "You have earned the right to call me Edgar." "Edgar," she repeated. "That is your wife's feather. I cannot—" "It is my wife's feather," he said, "and I have held it for 40 years. It has brought me comfort and it has brought me pain, but I think it is time for it to bring someone else comfort." He pressed the feather into her hands. It was soft, worn, the barbs smoothed by decades of fingers. "I have watched you," Edgar said, "the way you care for my son, the way you care for me. You have the same hands as my Eleanor, the same hands that could coax life out of a stone." He paused. "I think she would have liked you." Claire's eyes burned. She looked down at the feather and she thought of the other feather, the one she had pulled from the fire, the one that now sat on William's desk. 2 feathers, 2 halves of a love story that had spanned 40 years and had somehow impossibly found its way to her. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was thick. "I will keep it safe." Edgar nodded, and then he did something that surprised her. He reached out and patted her hand, a brief, awkward gesture, the touch of a man who had not learned to be soft. "Take care of him," he said. "He will not ask for it, but he needs it." "I know," Claire said. "I will." The last day of spring came with a storm. It blew in from the north, black clouds rolling over the mountains, and the rain came down in sheets. Claire was in the kitchen when it started, and she watched through the window as the courtyard turned to mud and the wind bent the young trees along the path. William came in from the yard soaked to the bone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He shook himself like a dog, and Claire winced. "You are going to catch your death," she said. "It is just rain," he said. "I have been rained on before." He came to stand by the hearth where the fire was burning high, and he held his hands out to the warmth. Claire watched him for a moment, the way the firelight taut the lines of his face, the way he stood with his weight shifted to one leg, the way he looked, for the first time in his life, like a man who was not alone. "Do you remember the first time you came to this kitchen?" he asked. Claire nodded. "I was terrified." "You hid it well," he said. "You looked at me like I was the one who should be afraid." "I was," Claire said. "I was afraid of you. I was afraid of this place. I was afraid of wanting something I could not keep." William turned to look at her. "And now?" Claire thought about it. She thought a bow. Think the winter, the fire, the soup, the night. He had told her he could taste her. She thought about the feather in her pocket, and the man who had given it to her, and the man standing in front of her now, dripping wet and looking at her like she was the sun. "Now," she said, "I am still afraid, but I am afraid with you, and that is different." William crossed the kitchen and took her face in his wet hands. He kissed her, slow and warm, and she tasted rain and smoke and something that was beginning to taste like hope. "Good," he said against her lips, "because I am not going anywhere." The storm raged outside, but the kitchen was warm. The fire crackled, the pot simmered, and Claire thought that this was what she had been looking for her whole life. Not a place, not a person, but a moment, held between two hands, that felt like home. She made him learn to make soup that night, not because he needed to, and not because she wanted to teach him, but because he asked. He stood at the hearth with a knife in his hand and a look of fierce concentration on his face, and he let her guide him through every step. The onions, the garlic, the broth, the herbs. He was terrible, he was slow. He burned his fingers and cut the bread wrong and spilled half the broth on the floor. But he did not give up. He stood there, in his castle kitchen in the middle of a spring storm, and he learned to make soup. And when it was done, when the pot was bubbling and the smell had filled the room, he ladled it into a bowl and held it out to her. "You taste it," he said. "Tell me if it is any good." Claire took the bowl. She blew on the soup, then took a small sip. It was not good. It was too salty, and the vegetables were uneven, and there was far too much pepper, but it was warm, and it was made with hands that had learned to hold her, and it tasted, impossibly, like love. "It is perfect," she said. William looked at her, and she saw the doubt in his eyes. "It is not, I can tell by your face." "It is perfect," she repeated, "because you made it. That is all that matters." He did not argue. He just took the bowl from her hands, set it on the table, and pulled her into his arms. They stood there, in the warm kitchen, the storm outside, the fire crackling, and Claire thought of the winter, and the snow, and the first time she had walked up this path. She had come to cook for a sick old man. She had stayed to learn that strength was not the same as wholeness, and that love was not the same as weakness, and that home was not a place you found. It was a place you made, a bowl at a time, a fire at a time, a hand held in the dark at a time. The storm passed. The spring turned to summer, and in the warm kitchen at the heart of the castle, Claire and William learned, together, the slow and patient art of being home. And somewhere upstairs, an old man slept with a gray feather on his pillow, dreaming of a woman he had loved 40 years ago, and of the widow who had taught his son that the strongest thing a man could do was to let himself be loved. The fire crackled, the soup simmered, and the kitchen at last was warm. Sometimes, saving a broken heart doesn't require an army. It just takes a warm bowl of soup, a gentle touch, and a promise to stay. Did William and Claire's healing journey warm your soul? If you believe in the quiet power of love, leave a heart in the comments, hit subscribe, and join us for the next unforgettable romance.